So, well, thank you for coming. Thank you, and thank you to the Theosophical Society and for hosting this very fancy online. Really, I think it's quite remarkable. And, oh yeah, it's great. And yeah, for everybody who came in the gray, misty winter weather and all of that late in the afternoon. Yeah, so I'm Diane Berger, and I'm going to, I think you all know the topic of this presentation is about 3-year retreat in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And before I get started, though, I would like to ask my compatriot here, Steve Wilhelm, to say a few words about himself, because then once I launch, I'll be talking, about my retreat.
Yeah.
So, but he's going to interview me or prompt me with things.
So that's why there's a context, I guess. Yeah. And we've known each other for many, many years.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've done a lot of retreat. I think more than a year of retreats, longer than a month, and a whole bunch of little ones. So nothing like 3 years, but a lot. And I teach through Dharma stuff, teach at Eastside Insight in Kirkland, and I'm on the board of Clear Mountain Monastery and Tibetan Nuns Project, and I've edited a bunch of Dharma books. I'm on the 6th book right now, and a former journalist, which is part of where the interview creds allegedly come from.
And you should say how many years you were a journalist, because it's
I was a journalist,
amazing.
35 years.
Yeah, 35 years as for Puget Sound Business.
28 of it, yeah, covered aerospace. Yeah. In the middle of doing Dharma. So they let me do long retreats. So it was amazing.
Yeah.
I got leaves of absence to go on retreat.
And now you edit
I edit Northwest Dharma News. I didn't say that.
Yeah, that's also interesting. Yeah, so I'm really honored that he came along with me. Yeah.
We did a story on Northwest Dharma News right after your retreat, and then books to them.
You've done some things in Northwest Dharma News. Yeah,
amazing activities.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so now I've got all kinds of preparation for to talk about. And also, I always want to say to people that I'm a much better writer than talker. So I would like to apologize at the beginning for all of the, my mind gets kind of, maybe I'll forget words or something like that. So anyway, just bear with me. But my writing, I'm really more of a writer, way more of a writer than a talker. But anyway, so that's why I have some notes. So the first thing to know is that this long retreat that I did, it was in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It's a traditional form in Tibetan Buddhism. And I did it between the years of 2011 and 2015. It was 3.5 years actually. But it's called 3-year retreat. That they have a term for it in Tibetan. It's 3-year retreat. So anyway, and then I did an additional 9 months after I finished. About 6 months, approximately 6 months later, I went into a second retreat for 9 more months. So, although my book doesn't talk about the second retreat. So, but then another thing to know is that I entered into Buddhism in 1989. And so now we're getting to the 35-year point pretty soon here, I think. And it's Tibetan Buddhism in the Nyingma school. So some of you I don't know if everybody knows any details whatsoever about the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but there are 4 major schools. The Dalai Lama's in a different one. This is the Nyingma school, is the old school. It's the kind of original one from the 7th century when Buddhism went to Tibet. Anyway, I won't get into that. And in 1996, I took a 1-year trip with my kids, and we went. A big part of that trip, well, it was in Asia. It was in India and Nepal, and that's where I met my teacher. I had a teacher before that, Dza Kilung Rinpoche, who's very famous, but passed away now. And then on this long trip, I met this other young lama, Kilung Rinpoche, and I ended up bringing him to Seattle. He'd never been out of Asia before. He was born and raised in Tibet and crossed over the Himalayas by foot. And I met him in the south of India. And it's a long story, but I ended up bringing him here eventually. And we had a group here called Pema Kilaya. Actually, we started a nonprofit organization first called the Kilung Foundation. And then from that, we started this Dharma, this Buddhist organization. And so those organizations are still going strong. And so he and I worked together very intensively for about 15 years. And by the way, when I first went into my retreat, I already had many years of experience in Buddhism before, from whatever, 1989 to 2011. So I had all of those many years of experience in Buddhism before my retreat. And so anyway, so he and I worked together for 15 years before my retreat. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. And before my retreat, we ended up moving. We were invited to move to Whidbey Island. And so there's a big group of Dharma practitioners over on Whidbey. And so they created this kind of foundation over there, or, this platform or whatever for him to teach there and live there. And now they've built a temple, a very, very, very beautiful temple on Whidbey Island. And anyway, but before that temple was built, I went into retreat. Sorry. And then once I came out of retreat, instead of going back to Whidbey Island, I settled back here in Seattle. I'm from Seattle. My family is here, and I just wanted to kind of be more on my own instead of being overwhelmed constantly with all of the work of running a foundation again and a Buddhist Sangha and all of that. So, but I'm still very connected with all of, with their activities there and connected to him personally and stuff. So anyway, okay, so then I wanted to tell you about, I wanted to tell you some of the basics about retreat, about 3-year retreat, because that's why you're here. But I wanted you to hear that I had substantial experience. I mean, that's the main point actually of what I just said, was that I had substantial experience in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, in kind of, working very closely, going many, many times to Asia with this Lama and to Tibet, including to Tibet, and kind of understudying him in a way. So then went into retreat finally in 2011. So, so I wanted to tell you some of the basics of retreat, or of this type of retreat. There are some things that you need before you go into a retreat of this magnitude, and one is experience. So in fact, I did the math. Okay, 22 years. It was 22 years of, quite, substantial experience. I had a teacher, the Kilung Rinpoche. So that's very, very important. Extremely important is to have, to have a very close relationship with a teacher during the whole retreat, actually. And I often emphasize that with people. And there are many reasons for that. Another thing is to have a curriculum. So when you go into retreat, you're not just, doing whatever, right? It's a plan. You've got a plan, and that's, it could be different. Even with the same teacher with different students, that curriculum could be different, actually. But there is a kind of classic curriculum in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and I kind of followed that pretty much, I would say. But it wasn't up to me totally. Some small things along the way I got to choose, but a lot of it was chosen. Most of it was, directed by my teacher. Yeah. And so I had that. I had the support of my Sangha, my Buddhist group, and that included some financial support too. So it was so a lot of. I mean, this whole retreat was not expensive. I don't know how much it was. I'm not sure I've ever added it all up, but it was. I didn't have a lot of money because I'd been doing all this work, mostly for free or for what do you call it, survival stipend, or with free rent, or that sort of livelihood. So so I didn't have much money, but the Sangha came forward and gave me a stipend. And also I had some friends, some of whom were Buddhists and some of whom were not Buddhist, who actually gave some financial support. And then I also had permission. I like to say this. I had permission of my family to go off because, it's a big deal. When I went off, I had, at that point, I had one grandchild already and two grown-up children and my mother and father and, all these people. And so I had their sort of blessing, or, to greater or lesser degrees from different people, but basically. So there was one thing I was missing. One thing I was missing on my retreat, and that was a place. Normally, and I'm going to go into this a little bit later here in these notes, but one thing that was unusual about this retreat was that I didn't have a place. So I had all the things I needed, but where was I going to go? No retreat center. We didn't have a retreat center on Whidbey Island. Now there are some retreat cabins actually, but so I had to, I just was scratching my head, okay, how am I going to solve that? And so I figured out that I could do this by house sitting, basically. So I house sat for long periods of time in what turned out to be very, very beautiful places. Most of them had beautiful views, or I could walk to a place with some sky view or something. But so I was in like 5 different places, and I moved some of them. I moved back to again, numerous times or whatever. So I think I ended up having 9 different locations, or 9 different, hops or whatever to the next place. So I'm going to tell you now where I was. So I was on 3 different islands here in the in this kind of Puget Sound, San Juan Island area. I was on Bainbridge Island, I was on San Juan Island, Orcas Island. So, for varying lengths of time. And anyway, and then I also was in a very small town, very close to the Pacific Ocean, called Raymond, Washington. And yeah. And then I was also, the 5th place that I was at was in Southern Oregon, way high up in the Siskiyou Mountains. And that was at a retreat center, actually. Retreat center. Yeah. But I was in a cabin on my own. It was not a retreat center where there were lots of people coming and going and stuff. But anyway, and that was also very beautiful and wilderness. It was right next to BLM land, and amazing, the wilderness, the wildlife that I saw when I was actually there in that place was amazing because of I saw many bears, and one cougar, but all kinds of other creatures too that were amazing. This is really interesting. So, okay, sip of water. So I wanted to talk about the difference between my retreat and a more traditional style of retreat. And this traditional style of retreat comes from Tibet. Although I do want to say that in Tibet, there are many people who do retreat there that don't, where the retreat doesn't conform to this traditional style. There are, many people over the centuries who've been on long retreat who do it as a kind of wandering yogi or yogini. And so, so in my retreat, was kind of a wandering kind of retreat in a way because of all the many places that I stayed, I had to move around a little bit, or quite a bit. But so the traditional kind of 3-year retreat for a first retreat, like if you're an advanced practitioner who's already done a 3-year retreat, then you could go away into a cabin all by yourself and do 10 years of completely solitude, or something like that. But for a first-year retreat, it's not a good idea. Could be a very bad idea, in fact. So a normal traditional retreat would be, maybe you would have 8 people. 8 is kind of a good number for that, but it could be any number really. And then that group is sequestered, in a, with boundaries, physical boundaries, and maybe the boundaries are quite small actually, and maybe they can't even go for a walk really, or maybe they can, but it's hard. It would depend on the situation. But so they kind of form their own little society inside of this boundaried situation. And that socialization and support is really an important ingredient, especially in the first couple of years. And because these people who are in retreat, they never leave the retreat. That's it. And their teacher will come into their compound and give teachings and give private instruction, or how are you doing, that kind of thing. And then they would have some kind of attendant kind of person who would probably be living right next to them, or checking in with them extremely regularly, and bringing all the groceries that they need. In some retreats, maybe that person would also do the cooking, but I think in most retreats, the retreatants do their own cooking. It would depend, and let's see. And then they would practice. So in their daily practice, some of the practice would be together as a group, and some would be individual practice in their little cabins. Yeah, so that is a traditional retreat. Mine was, I was by myself. There was not another person, going around with me to all these different house sitting situations. And so I was in a position then of needing some kind of socialization and human support in the beginning. And so this was filled in for me with permission from my teacher to have contact by phone with my family. But then also I had, in every one of those places that I was in, there was someone who would bring me my groceries, and I would be in contact with them with my grocery list by email. I bought a little teeny tiny computer. And so I would email them my grocery list. And then that person was also really an important ingredient because they would also check on me, to see if I seemed okay or not. And also, of course, I had contact with my teacher, but he and I didn't have, it wasn't usually set up on a weekly schedule or anything like that. And so, and then and then I just fell into this fortunate thing of having a confidant, who was my sister-in-law, actually, who was also a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and also had background, she's an artist, but with background in Jungian symbolism and a lot of deep mystical spirituality, like Christian mysticism and different things. So she was actually an incredible resource for me, and I'm not sure the whole thing would have worked without her, actually. And we didn't plan it, so that was just really lucky. And we both saw it immediately at the beginning of my retreat, because she lives on Bainbridge and I was on Bainbridge, and we just, it arose sort of like very fortunately that we both could see it. And that socialization and support I needed that for about the first 1.5 to 2 years. And then after that, I didn't need it anymore. And it was very clear to everybody I didn't need it. I mean, including me, my teacher, anybody. Yeah. And that's normal. So one of the things also was that, so I'm going to talk about sort of the hurdles of retreat, because there are a bunch of hurdles with this kind of prolonged retreat. So one of them gets into a kind of mystical level, which the Theosophical Society people would know something about, I think, because this comes up in the Hermetic tradition, and these different mystical traditions, which is if there is somebody who is really wants to become really an adept, that they need to do this hard work. And it's there were in medieval times, there were drawings made of like an adept in a big pot, one of those, a big huge cauldron of boiling water, with their assistant bringing more wood for the fire. So that is actually, so when you go into a 3-year retreat, there are mystical boundaries that are put onto, you're asking for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but you're asking for the guardians of the place, the local guardians, and you're asking for everybody to come in and support this retreat. You're asking them to make sure to keep all obstacles away, but also you want all the circumstances to come forth to assist this person to make gains, in the spiritual gains, internal gains, right? And so, so it's like you are unconsciously, I mean, I didn't know about all of this, actually. I knew about some of it kind of vaguely, but I really didn't know many things about what this was going to be like. But so you could consciously know about it, but you can also unconsciously know about it, and it's still going to happen. So it is still going to happen that you're going to go into a period of potentially excruciating psychological, thumb screws, or, whatever, however you want to say that. But, and since, so I didn't know about it. Kilung Rinpoche, my teacher, told me, like months into the retreat, where I am sweating bullets, kind of. I mean, I'm having, all kinds of psychological, like, crying sessions, and all this stuff is coming up. And I'm already a very I would say a normal person. I'm not, I'm a person who doesn't is not unstable. I'm a stable kind of psychologically stable type of person. And so, but this was like, wow, wow. And then Kilung Rinpoche said, well, this is normal for 3-year retreat. And I'm like, what? I, I did not know this. And then after retreat, and then talking to other people who know something about this, who told me, yes, this is normal. That is a normal part of retreat. And so anyway, it's like I'm thinking, this is my thought about this. I haven't read this exactly, but that this thing about putting yourself into this form where you're asking for it. You're asking for it. That's the assignment. And then kind of once I understood that, then I went, okay, got it. Here we go. And, so that state of difficulty usually lasts at least 1 year, at least. And so that's one thing. And that's a reason that you need support. You need you can't really go off on your own completely with no social support at all whatsoever in the very beginning. Now, if you wanted to do a second 3-year retreat, yes, maybe that'll be fine, or a third one. Some people do a whole series of them. But in the beginning, you need that support. And what I was going to also, it's really interesting to me and important to say, is that period of time that's so difficult will also arise for Tibetans. So it's not a problem. It's not a special problem of Westerners. And in Tibet, traditionally, they want to check in on that person to find out if they're really literally going crazy or not. And then, so those check-ins then by the grocery shopper people and the lama checking, or the confidant checking, it's like checking, making sure that that person is really still okay. Even if they're in the middle of upset, that's different than really going crazy. These are two different things. And so, yeah. So anyway, it was interesting. There also can be other problems brought on by imbalances in the subtle body. But those are, handleable with a teacher, again, who can, recognize the signs and give you a prescription of practice, a practice prescription to get out of that. And I had some of that too, and etc. And yeah, so and by the way, so all of this, I've written this memoir. I guess I didn't really say that at the beginning of this talk, but I wrote this memoir called Small Boat, Vast Ocean, My Years in Solitary, I think that's the name of it. Yeah, Solitary Buddhist Retreat, whatever it's called. Anyway, so I published that book last March, and Quest Bookstore has copies of it, and I brought some extra copies. But anyway, so I did go into that. All of these things it's a spiritual memoir about this retreat anyway. And also it's available on Amazon, which I'm sorry to say that out loud in front of the manager of Quest Bookstore. But yeah, but anyway, you can find it, and I have a website for this book too, so you can read what do you call it, endorsements and excerpts and things like that from the book, so you can find out that the writing is really much better than my talking. Yeah. Okay. This is the part where we can
be dialogue. That was great. I think that's really wonderful to lay that all out. Yeah, what's our time frame?
So we want to have time left over for questions, so we should just do this for another half hour.
Okay. So in terms of the big why question, I mean, can you talk a little bit about what was your impetus like? What were you hoping to accomplish, if that's the right word, in 3 years, and what kind of kept you going? You sort of touched on that in some ways, but there's kind of like an inner inspiration piece, in the middle of the night, we're like, what kept you thinking, I want to keep doing this?
Of course, there were a couple of moments where I was like, oh my God, I can't do it. I can't continue, but there's nothing else I want to be doing. There was like, I didn't want to leave retreat to do something else, but a few times I was like, get me out of here. Anyway, and that's apparently is totally normal in a 3-year retreat. So I wanted, about that. Basically, going into retreat and staying in retreat and all that was a continuation of, I think, the thing that first propelled me into Buddhism. Even before, I mean, I had heard of Buddhism, of course, as a teenager, but as a teenager, I think it was kind of basically a form of bodhicitta, the wish to help other beings, and to be of service. I know a lot of the traditional teachings in Buddhism assume that the reason that people want to be on a spiritual path and want to be a Buddhist is because of the suffering that they experience, and they want to lift themselves out of suffering. But when that I feel it wasn't the story for me. And I think maybe for a lot of Westerners, it's also not the story of wanting to lift themselves out of their own suffering. But I think a lot of people maybe have come to it because it's not native, to American culture. And so we find it and we go, oh, bingo, that's it. That's what I was looking for. But so I think anyway, starting as a teenager, I had this wish to serve. And from that, and then a longing to find my path, because Christianity wasn't really, even though I was raised as a Christian, I felt estranged from it for a number of reasons. But
Thank you, Joe. Let me ask the question. I'm sort of asked, in terms of the actual 3 years of retreat circumstance, kind of like what was your compass? Like what kept you?
Well, this is it. This is
Okay,
it. This is
right.
it. I'm getting it. Well, I mean, I'm getting there. So for me, also because of my background, my family background and so forth, there was this feeling of the inner work of was very important. And so when Buddhism became clear, then it became to me an inner journey. This is like an inner journey. It's an adventure. The inner journey can be so intense, psychologically and emotionally. The inner journey is so important, and it's integral for Buddhism. This inner journey, right? And so it's a quest, and so retreat, then going into retreat, isn't then just a continuation of that. So it's like, self-development in order to benefit others. I remember as a teenager, there was one point, in fact, where I was saying, or was it as a teenager? Maybe it was a little later in my 20s, actually, where I was saying, okay, should I do something in the outer world, or should I do something in the spiritual world? And I just felt like the spiritual world, for me, it was more ultimate, anyway. And then retreat being just, this continuation of that journey. And so, and interestingly, when you said North Star, I think, or compass,
Compass, yeah.
compass. I often, when I'm teaching people, or I often refer to bodhicitta, which is the wish to benefit others in a big way, or in a deep way, or a continuous way. That that's their North Star for Buddhists.
But in terms of, can I be, I'm being a term.
And then
There
there's
you go.
also persistence.
There you go. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Because I think people, they like keep going when it's hard. It's like, what kept you going when it was hard? Because this sounds a little, like putting a fire of it. Like what, you know what I mean?
Well, I think there's a personality
Yeah.
trait that I have, which is being very persistent and also making a commitment to something. So those personality things combined with this, like what else is there? Like when I wanted to quit, for example, I'm like, well, there's nothing else I want to do. What do I want to leave retreat for? Yeah. And so now in post-retreat, I'm feeling that, it's like the fruition is, I'm helping, I'm serving I'm teaching Buddhism. I wrote this book actually as kind of a gift, because when I came out of retreat, I had, I was expanded very much so, but then going back into ordinary life, that expansion contracts once again quite a bit. And so I felt like, well, what can I want really this retreat to really be of benefit. So that's was my motivation for writing it, was to give a gift. Yeah.
And you alluded to all these, in the first year, and there's a lot of stuff in the book, which is really pretty powerful, by the way. But all these things that came up, and let's say your stuff basically in your former marriage, you were feeling things about, and a lot of stuff like that. How did that, over the 3 years, can you say a little more about how that changed? Kind of what was a shift in energy towards, say, the last second year or third year in terms of those issues and where you were?
Right. So so there was a whole, there's, in this kind of 3-year retreat, there's a whole trajectory that's normal. And I went through that. Really, the first year, I had all of, well, I already talked about it. You guys already heard all about that. I don't have to repeat that. And then in the second year, a lot of that kind of big upset had dissolved, or I had solved it, and that was amazing, actually. And Kilung Rinpoche, even at the time, said that's a kind of a miracle of this retreat, is that you got through that. Or that's not miracle, he didn't use that word, it was kind of like the result of retreat. Like you don't have to look for the mystical experiences. In fact, in Tibetan Buddhism, the mystical experiences are thought to be a hindrance often, because they're so yummy, and that people get distracted by that, and then attached to that, which is a pitfall, and then the attachment becomes an obstacle for further development. But now okay, let me have some water and think about where I am in that long tangent. Okay, so let me just go to this. So in the second year, there was another thing that came up because of doing practice too intensively, and that caused problems on the level of the subtle body, and so that caused a lot of anxiety. So then in the second year, I had a lot of anxiety coming up, and that was not comfortable at all either.
And a couple of times I was going, get me out of here. But then Kilung Rinpoche was able to, give me exercises, physical and kind of mental exercises to dissolve that. And so and I can't remember exactly when it was, but sometime toward the end of the second year, I think, where I had another year and a half to go at least, or more, I think, all of that completely dissolved. It all dissolved, all the problems. It was like one day of bliss after the other, basically, of really, deep practice and lots of, this kind of expansion was taking place. And I'm not saying every moment was in a bliss state. It wasn't like that, but it was quite amazing after that. And that is apparently fairly normal in a 3-year retreat, that you get to that. Did I answer that question? Okay. Let's see if there's, also I wanted to say, related to that, let's see, and some lasting changes, because I was talking about this kind of expansion that kind of has contracted since then, but there have been some lasting changes, I would say, from that retreat. And one is this one, which is actually a very interesting point, and I do talk about it in the book too, but and this started toward the end of the retreat, or in the third year, anyway, the third year of retreat, where I began letting go of the one-pointed goal of enlightenment. So there is, without giving up the path. It's like holding both of those at the same time. This paradox that Buddhism is very famous for, and I think other traditions may be famous for that same thing. So it was a big loosening of the goal orientation of our culture. So it exists not only in our culture, it's also in traditional Asian cultures, but it's particularly severe in our culture, our Western culture. This linear idea, one step after the other, and you're gonna get there, and being dogged about it, and kind of, very attached to these goals. And it's so very difficult in something like Buddhism. It's like in Christianity, it's like you can just be a good person, and there's no expectation that you're going to become another Jesus. But in Buddhism, there is, there's this kind of expectation, or, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, because in Tibetan Buddhism, it's said that it's the path of, I can't think of what it's called right now, actually, but the path where, you can become enlightened in one lifetime, in this one lifetime. And so that's a lot of expectation and pressure. And it's like, oh my God. And so there is an enormous paradox to kind of resolve. And I feel like it did finally resolve, maybe finally, but I'm still goal oriented in the things that I do. I published a book, my God. But there's a big relaxation around this whole enterprise of the Enlightenment enterprise. So that was a great book title for somebody. Anyway, so that was one thing. And another thing is that is hung on nicely is that when people ask me a Dharma question, I often have a ready answer for them. You know, it's like, okay, here it is, blah, 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 there you go. You know, it's easy. It's like there's an ease to answering people's needs or wishes or something. But not always, but yeah.
You know, I like about I think you just said, the answer you just gave is the paradox you're talking to kind of gets at really the first question I was asking. So I think you nailed it. You know, in terms of that paradox of how you were in a space, a place, and the goal was not held in a tight way. I think that's really beautiful. And speaking of paradoxes, here's another one that, in a sense, compared to the more traditional circumstance for a 3-year retreat, you know, with a collective of people, you were solitary. But on the other hand, especially you had your sister-in-law, sister-in-law, Barbara, and who had the kind of intimacy that most people wouldn't have in a group setting. You know, they kind of be with these people, but they wouldn't really know them. A lot of times, those get really difficult.
Oh, you would get to know them.
But sometimes those get really difficult.
They get really difficult. Yes.
So here's someone you love. And you have a beautiful connection with her. So I wanted you to speak to that paradox a little bit, because you learned something about solitude, and at the same time you had this beautiful heart connections. You navigated it in a very unusual and wonderful way.
Well, I'm not sure that I know your question, but one thing I will say is that
kind of the paradox.
The need for her dissolved at one point, and so we concluded that after about 2 years. We only did that for about 2 years, and then it wasn't needed anymore. Yeah. And then there were times when she needed my help a little bit, you know, too.
But it almost seems like that really helped you navigate the solitude in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
What did you learn from solitude?
Wow. Well, funny you should ask. I have some notes about that.
Well, no,
okay. Yeah. This is disappearing. Okay. Well, so, you know, I think that there are some really obvious things about solitude benefiting spiritual development. You know, you're able to deepen your meditation, and or it helps to deepen the meditation. You can, and then deeper and deeper, and there are deeper levels. There are more deeper levels. You know, it keeps going, and in solitude and silence, you know, those can open up, right? And also one thing I think that people know about already is that it increases that silence, especially dealing with other people. I became aware of how much it increased my own mindfulness and my awareness, because I would have to communicate with somebody without speaking. This was later in the retreat where I gave up, where I went into real solitude, but my grocery shoppers still had to come, you know, and I had to tell them something. So it was a one-way, you know, they could tell me things that I wasn't speaking, you know, and yeah, that was beautiful practice, actually. That was a wonderful thing to do. I mean, anybody could do that anytime, actually. I recommend it. Or even writing notes. And sometimes if it was too complicated, I had to write a note and I had to hand them the note, you know. And then, yeah, I loved that. I mean, it was kind of a fun game in a way, you know, but it increased this mindfulness and care, you know, kind of like now I'm really listening to them or caring about them. So instead of me, it's them. Yeah, that was lovely. But I wanted to say, well, okay, that I found, in the last part of the retreat where I was really doing silence and really solitude at that point, not calling my family hardly at all anymore. And I found that, okay, I wrote something about this because it's interesting. Ultimately, so the silence is ultimately, in this context anyway, ultimately to break our attachment to concepts. And this is a key to the realization of non-duality. And this realizing non-duality is a key to, in this tradition, to finding, the enlightened state. So our linguistic habit is intertwined with our attachment to concepts. And so we can begin to loosen that attachment to concepts through this practice of silence, because we're not vocalizing anymore. Right. And so, and I found that I could see that happening toward the end of the retreat. So nobody told me about this idea. I mean, I didn't read it in a book, but it was just something that I experienced, and that was extremely, uh, illuminating. The other thing I wanted to say about this practice of silence. So when I was in up in Williams, and I was at this retreat center, there were sometimes I would see some other people who were there on retreat, and they were in silence. And I noticed a couple of them were like, what would walk around the grounds, like trying to ignore other people, or, and like kind of the hooded, the old vision or whatever of a hooded monk, right? And I thought, that's funny. Why are they doing that? What's that about? And I thought, this doesn't match with me. This doesn't match with my philosophy about this whole, about being in silence or solitude or whatever. And it seems very aggressively pushing away or something. And I asked my teacher about it at that time, and he agreed that, at least for me anyway, that wasn't really ideal, that this kind of walling off. So the solitude and silence isn't about walling off life. And this is more of a, now this is this tradition, this is the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is not as monastic. There are lots and lots of householder practitioners and yogis and yoginis. I mean, they're not wanting to forever go away from society. They're, even if they're on long retreat, most of them, not all of them, but most of them come out to teach and be, interrelated or interacting with other people and society. And anyway, I won't go off on too long of a tangent and teach basic Tibetan Buddhism, but anyway, so I just thought that was interesting to mention also. Yeah.
So I think a
Yeah.
few more things, and then
Yeah.
we button it up at 5:30, leave some room for maybe a couple more things, and then.
And then questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and you sort of touched on, but in terms of, a lot of people, when they think of the path, they think of spiritual experiences. And you sort of, but then there's a whole question of how do we change? And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, because you've sort of, who do we become? What's how are we different because of the journey versus the spiritual experiences we had during it? Or if you could touch on that in terms of your retreat.
I'm not sure I completely understand, but I think, the idea is to be more compassionate, bodhicitta, and to be able to be as expanded as possible with the least amount of partiality, to have impartial love and compassion for others, and to be really clear at the same time, really awake and, not spaced out, but, present. So presence, the present moment, bodhicitta, compassion, love, yeah.
Yeah, maybe try a different way. Forgetting, I'm probably not asking the right, but I'm thinking,
Okay.
during 3 years, I'm sure stuff happened, like you had experiences and some intense arisings and things, but you also became a change, and I wonder, because sometimes people get hung up on the experiences and I think that's what it's about, but it's really more about who we become. I wonder if
Right, right.
yeah, I wonder if you could,
Well, right. Yeah, you're right.
yeah,
That's it.
there you go. Is there anything you learned about that from the journey of the 3 years? You talked about sort of the beguiling, sort of the
Right,
candy
right,
of
right,
experiences
right, right.
sometimes.
Well, just, yeah. So there's when toward the end of retreat, I don't know, this still may not answer anything, your question actually directly, but I had the image of those old ancient Chinese paintings, like scroll paintings, that are almost like not calligraphy, but kind of, and of a mountain, like a mountain path. And there's a little tiny man, an old wizened practitioner of some kind, going up the path with something on his back or something. And I thought, I want to be like that, nothing, everything just ordinary, you know, nothing special, nothing special. Yeah. And yeah, so that is still with me, actually. That is still also very, very much with me. Yeah, as I'm going. Yeah.
Maybe the last question is, especially for talking to people who don't have the chance to do that, but you had a profound change because of 3 years in retreat. Is there any way you sort of learned about even short retreat is valuable? Is there anything you learned about that you would encourage people to do retreat from this, huge circumstance you were able to do?
I don't encourage people to do 3-year retreat.
No, I'm not saying that, but like.
No, but I want to say
Yeah,
that
there
because
you
that's
go.
interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody is a really committed practitioner and they're talking to their teacher about it and they want encouragement from me, of course, I'm giving encouragement. There's somebody right now, in fact, that I'm helping because that person is really, that's their path and it's, but I'm not a proponent. I'm not going around advertising this as a thing. Because of all of the factors, that I've just talked about, right? Yeah, so many factors. People having spouses is a big factor where you don't, it's not this thing just to go off on 3-year retreat and leave your spouse for such a long period of time. That's, too much for most marriages. But
I guess I'm asking, is there any way you can sort of like, I don't know, flip it down?
oh, right.
Shorter retreat.
Short retreats.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think short retreats are great. Yeah. Yeah, and all kinds of retreat. There are all types and styles of retreat. I sometimes talk to people, encourage people to do what I used to do when I was a beginning Tibetan Buddhist, which I called half-day retreats, where I would just be at home and I would make a commitment. And I say, to people, you need to start with a beginning date and an ending date and decide on that ahead of time because it gives energy to what will come up, then what will be possible in that retreat. So, and it could be, you can decide like 4 hours a day for a certain amount of time. It could be for 5 months, it could be for 1 month, it could be for 1 week, whatever. But I did many of those and it was just something I kind of made up. But I think because with our busy lives and our busy, our culture is a busy culture, you know, it's not a lazy culture. And Sogyal Rinpoche used to talk about that. Our culture is lazy busy, or busy lazy, or something like that. He was saying you're lazy because you're not practicing enough, and it's because you're busy. So it's like, you know, but he said in Asia, the Asians are lazy, you know, lazy. You guys are lazy busy, you know. And anyway, that was him, you know, talking about that. But so it worked. It's hard. It's still hard for me to put aside all those busy things to do, you know, practice, unless I make a thing out of it. So that's one way of doing that, is to make something up, like half-day retreat or something. Anyway, that's just one example. So yeah, I did.
Well, maybe that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.